It was imagined how the Marvel Universe would tremble if Khorne, the blood god, were ever to cross its threshold. A storm of crimson light had been said to tear through the fabric of the skies, a wound in reality itself that refused to close. The air had grown heavy, thick with heat and the scent of iron, as though the atmosphere itself had begun to bleed. Across the earth, hearts had pounded in uneven rhythm, each beat echoing with unseen fury, each breath carrying the taste of war. Through the churning scar in the heavens, a form had begun to take shape. It had not descended with grace nor grandeur, but with the force of an ancient hatred-given body. The veil between dimensions had been split open, and from it emerged the one who was called the Blood God, the embodiment of endless battle, the master of every war ever fought or imagined. His presence was said to carry the weight of 10,000 battlefields, his shadow stretching across worlds. The crimson clouds had parted only to reveal a figure of monstrous scale, forged of brass and fury, clad in armor blackened by eons of bloodshed. Each step upon alien soil had caused the ground to tremble, every motion radiating a fury older than time. The winds had screamed his name, though no mortal tongue could truly speak it without trembling. Where he stood, the world seemed to recoil. Flames had erupted from the torn air, painting the skyline in red and gold. Rivers boiled as the pressure of his existence bent the laws of nature. No words were spoken, no proclamation was made, yet his purpose had been felt by every living soul. A god of rage had entered a universe of heroes, and the balance that had kept it safe began to shatter. Whispers had spread through the dimensions that a power from the immaterium had found its way into reality. A being that drew strength not from worship, but from the violence of others. It was said that wherever anger took root, his gaze would follow. Wherever blood was spilled, his power would grow. And in that moment, as the crimson storm raged over the horizon, the Marvel Universe itself was marked by his arrival. The stage had been set not for conquest or mercy, but for a revelation that even a world filled with gods, heroes, and monsters could tremble before a force that cared only for war without end. The first heartbeat of the blood god had been felt, and with it, the promise that peace itself would soon become a forgotten dream. The red storm had not remained confined to Earth. Across the universe, the very fabric of space had been disturbed. What had begun as a fracture in the sky above one world had become a pulse that rippled through countless others. The vibration of that fury had reached the dark void between stars, unsettling powers that had long slumbered. It was said that even the Celestials, those ancient architects of existence, had turned their gaze toward the disturbance and found it unfamiliar, something that lay beyond the order they had built. In the depths of the dark dimension, Dormammu had felt it first. A heartbeat that did not belong to any living creature, a rhythm that beat to the tempo of slaughter. The flames of his realm had flickered and dimmed, not from fear, but from recognition. The essence of war itself had entered his universe. On Asgard, the Bifrost shimmered uneasily, its rainbow light dimmed by a spreading stain of red. The ancient runes carved into Odin's throne were said to have burned faintly, warning of a god older than their own lineage, a being not of creation, but of unending destruction. Across the cosmos, the same vision had taken hold, a throne of brass and bone rising from an ocean of blood, and upon it a shadow whose laughter silenced every star. The echoes of this vision had reached those attuned to the energies of existence, sorcerers, seers, and even gods. None could fully interpret what they felt, but all understood one truth. The universe was no longer stable. On Earth, Doctor Strange had found himself at the center of that imbalance. The relics within the Sanctum Sanctorum had begun to hum with dread. The eye of Agamotto had flared with warning, pulsing not in light, but in a deep crimson glow, as though reality itself had been stained. Strange had attempted to trace the disturbance, but his spells had dissolved upon contact with its source. The energies did not respond to reason or structure. They thrived on chaos and death. It was soon learned that Khorne's presence could not be measured like any cosmic entity before him. He did not exist within the normal flow of space and time. His essence was diffused through the emotions of every being capable of rage. Each act of violence, each spark of hatred, had acted as a beacon that strengthened his existence. It was as if the entire universe had become his temple, every battlefield his altar. The tremor of his arrival spread further, touching the edge of the astral plane, reaching worlds unseen by mortal eyes. Even in realms ruled by cosmic peace, sudden unrest had taken hold. Empires found themselves on the brink of war. Warriors who had once sworn oaths of unity felt an unexplainable urge to fight. The universe itself seemed to breathe faster, as though inhaling before the scream of an eternal war. And so it was understood that this was not merely an invasion. It was a corruption of nature itself. Khorne had not come to claim territory or thrones. He had come to awaken the buried rage that slept within every soul. His influence spread not through conquest, but through emotion. The Marvel Universe, vast and ancient, had known gods of mischief, gods of thunder, and gods of death, but now it faced something older and more primal, the god of rage, who demanded no devotion, only blood. The balance of existence had begun to falter. Order bent beneath the weight of chaos, and as the red storm widened its reach, the universe itself seemed to tremble in anticipation of what was yet to come. The first true war that no hero could ever win. As the echoes of Khorne's arrival continued to pulse through creation, his essence began to reveal its true nature. He was not a conqueror in the way mortal minds understood conquest. He did not desire thrones, wealth, or obedience. His dominion was far simpler and infinitely more terrible. Wherever conflict existed, he existed. Wherever blood was spilled, his shadow grew longer. His was a hunger that could never be satisfied, for every victory only birthed the next war. It had been understood by the mystics and scholars of the cosmos that Khorne was not bound by the same limits that confined gods of other realms. He did not create life. He consumed the meaning of it. He was described not as a being, but as a truth. That war would always exist, that violence would always find a place in the hearts of sentient beings. His power was drawn from the rage of mortals and immortals alike. Every sword swung in anger, every shot fired in hatred, every explosion that reduced cities to ash. All of it fed his strength, even as he stood upon Earth's frozen soil. His influence had begun to spread invisibly across the minds of warriors and killers. Soldiers in distant lands had felt it before their weapons fired. Their vision had narrowed, their hearts pounding faster, their fear turning to fury. The calmest leaders found themselves trembling with anger, unable to explain the heat that had begun to build behind their words. Humanity was being stirred from within, not controlled, not possessed, but provoked. Khorne did not need to speak to command obedience. He only needed them to hate. His appearance reflected that truth. He was not beautiful like the gods of Olympus, nor radiant like the beings of Asgard. His form was the embodiment of brutality. Armor forged from the bones of the fallen, horns that curved like the edges of ancient blades, and eyes that burned with the reflection of 1,000,000 wars. His weapon was said to hum with the cries of those it had slain, each echo a fragment of rage trapped forever in iron. His armor bore no symbol of peace, only the skull rune, the mark that had come to define his purpose. Those who could perceive beyond the physical had described his aura as unbearable. It was said that standing in his presence was like standing at the center of a collapsing sun, where all things were crushed beneath heat and fury. Yet there was order in his chaos. Khorne despised cowardice and trickery, loathed deceit and weakness. To him, combat was sacred. Every duel, every act of strength against strength, was a form of worship, even when the worshippers did not know his name. It was whispered that his voice, when it reached the psychic winds of the universe, carried no command and no emotion. It was the tone of inevitability, the sound of a universe where peace was nothing but the silence before the next battle. For millennia, this truth had remained sealed within the immaterium, contained by the laws that separated realities. But now those laws had been broken, and Khorne's creed had begun to spread across the stars. The sorcerers of Kamartaj had described it as a storm of emotion, pure, unfiltered wrath that could infect even the most disciplined mind. Strange had recognized it for what it was, not possession, but resonance. The blood god had become the vibration of war itself. His essence did not merely feed on violence, it multiplied it. Each act of aggression became a spark that ignited another, until the universe itself became an endless battlefield. And as that understanding spread among the few who could perceive his true nature, fear began to take on a new form. This was not a fear of invasion, nor of domination. It was the fear of awakening something that already lived within every creature capable of anger. Khorne did not bring war. He reminded the universe that it had always loved it. It was in that revelation that the true danger of the blood god was understood. He did not force the universe to destroy itself. He simply gave it permission. The first signs of Khorne's influence upon Earth had not arrived as fire or thunder, but as whispers carried through emotion. It had begun quietly, a faint agitation that settled over humanity like a fever that could not be cured. Tempers had grown shorter, patience thinner, and words that once carried reason had started to sharpen like blades. Across cities, the pulse of life had quickened, driven by an unseen force that demanded conflict. It was reported that small skirmishes erupted without warning. Protests that had begun peacefully descended into violence within moments. Streets that once held laughter became battlegrounds of frustration. News channels filled with images of chaos, yet no one could explain why. Nations accused each other of interference, unaware that the true enemy was not political, but divine. Khorne's shadow had been cast over the human heart, feeding on its oldest instinct, the desire to destroy. Military installations across the globe had begun to malfunction. Sensors failed, communication networks faltered, and soldiers felt an inexplicable compulsion to act without command. Some described hearing distant drums echoing through their dreams, the rhythm of which matched their heartbeats when they woke. It was not music, but a summoning, the call of war resonating through every mortal vein. The Avengers, scattered across the world, had each felt it in different ways. Tony Stark had noticed his AI systems generating combat protocols without his input. His machines had begun to predict conflict not as possibility, but as certainty. In Wakanda, T'Challa observed his warriors restless, their discipline faltering for the first time. On Asgard, the sky turned the color of rusted iron as ancient runes flared, warning of divine intrusion. The earth itself had seemed to react to the blood god's presence. Oceans churned without wind, mountains groaned beneath invisible weight, and the magnetic field pulsed with irregular rhythm. Energy signatures registered by SWORD and SH. IELD had shown fluctuations impossible to explain by science, not cosmic radiation, not magic, but something deeper. It was as if rage itself had become a measurable force. Doctor Strange, surrounded by relics that trembled at his command, had sensed the spreading corruption through the ley lines of the planet. The eye of Agamotto no longer glowed with its calm emerald hue. Instead, it flickered between gold and red, reacting to a power that thrived on conflict. Strange had described it as a vibration that could not be silenced. Every act of anger magnified it. Every act of peace weakened in its presence. The first ripple had not been physical. It was emotional, psychological, and spiritual. Yet the effects were undeniable. Ordinary people began to dream of war. Children woke crying from visions of battlefields drenched in blood. The human mind had become a conduit for the blood god's influence. Khorne did not need armies to invade. Humanity was building his temple within itself. By the third day, the phenomenon could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Conflicts flared simultaneously across continents. Skirmishes that should have ended in negotiation ended instead in slaughter. The world's peacekeepers became its first victims, consumed by the very violence they sought to control. The air seemed to hum with hostility, and it was said that even the animals had grown restless, howling and fighting without reason. Amidst the spreading disorder, an unnatural storm began to gather above the Arctic Circle, a swirling vortex of crimson clouds that reached from the upper atmosphere to the stratosphere. Its energy signature defied all known categories. It was not magic, not science, not any power Earth had yet classified. It was a tear in reality, one that beat like a living heart. The first ripple had become a wave, and through that storm a presence was waiting, vast, silent, and hungry. The blood god was watching. His domain was expanding. Every act of rage, every wound inflicted, was an offering upon his altar. The earth had become both battlefield and sacrifice, and before long its defenders would be forced to face the truth that every strike they made in anger, every battle they fought to save it, would only make him stronger. As the crimson vortex above the Arctic expanded, its pulse reached the mystic heart of Earth. In the sanctum sanctorum, ancient candles flickered in rhythms that matched the distant drums of war. It had been sensed first as a tremor in the fabric of magic itself, a distortion that bent every law of sorcery toward violence. The air inside the sanctum had thickened, heavy with tension, as though the very structure of reality were protesting something it could not repel. Dr. Stephen Strange had been deep in meditation when the first wave struck him. His astral form had been hurled outward, flung through dimensions as if pushed by a hurricane of rage. Every barrier he tried to raise dissolved instantly, consumed by the raw hostility that powered the disturbance. When he opened his eyes, blood had traced a line down his nose, and the relics around him had begun to hum with warning. The eye of Agamotto, normally a beacon of calm green light, had turned amber and red, flaring in sharp bursts that throbbed like a heartbeat. Strange had known immediately that this was not a spell, not a summoning, and not an incursion from any realm he understood. The presence behind it had not sought entry by stealth. It had forced its way through by sheer dominance. As his hands moved to trace the energies, the floor beneath him had rippled like disturbed water. The runes of protection carved into the sanctum's foundation had glowed briefly before dimming, as if drained of their strength. The magic that defended the earth had been overpowered not by complexity, but by purity, an emotion made power, a feeling given form. Strange had reached out through the astral plane, calling upon allies across the mystic networks of the world. Yet everywhere he reached, the same sensation had been felt: anger, violence, and chaos growing like a storm that fed upon itself. Across dimensions, sorcerers struggled to focus. Monks at Kamartaj fell from meditation, clutching their temples as visions of red oceans and burning skies filled their minds. The collective calm that anchored Earth's magical defenses had begun to fracture. Through the mirror dimension, Strange had attempted to visualize the source. At first, he had seen only light, red, shifting, unending. Then the light had taken shape. In its center stood a figure that distorted time and space, its outline vast and indistinct, its aura so oppressive that even the dimension of reflection cracked. Strange had been forced to withdraw, gasping for air as the glass walls of the sanctum splintered under invisible pressure. It had become clear to him that this presence was not feeding on magic. It was feeding on emotion. Every confrontation, every argument, every drop of blood shed in anger had become fuel. He had realized with dread that even Earth's defenders, if they fought this being in fury, would only empower it further. As he steadied himself, Strange had seen the storm spreading across the mystic map of the planet. From the Arctic heart of the vortex, crimson lines extended like veins through the continents, reaching into cities and battlefields alike. Each line pulsed with energy drawn from the living, anger made manifest. The realization struck him that humanity itself was the conduit. The sanctum's wards had then sounded their highest alarm, a resonance so deep it shook the foundations of New York. Strange understood the meaning instantly. The entity had crossed the veil fully. It was no longer pressing from the outside. It was here. The red storm above the poles had stabilized into a single column of burning light that pierced the atmosphere. Space itself had begun to ripple as if something massive were pushing through. Strange had whispered an invocation, but his words had faltered when the light shifted into shape. The moment had marked the beginning of revelation. What had been feared as energy was becoming matter. What had been sensed as fury was becoming flesh. The blood god was not approaching. He was emerging. And far above, the crimson storm had begun to form a face. Silent, watching, and utterly merciless. The warnings had spread faster than lightning. Every system linked to planetary defense began reporting impossible readings, spikes of energy that refused to follow any known frequency. The message that reached the Avengers compound was brief and direct. Something vast had entered Earth's atmosphere, and the Arctic sky was bleeding. In the early hours of dawn, the compound's perimeter lights flickered as though the entire world were holding its breath. Tony Stark had been the first to act, his scanners already locked on the crimson storm forming near the magnetic pole. The data on his screens made no sense. Power readings shifted between energy, matter, and something entirely new, emotion quantified into force. His AI struggled to interpret it, recalculating endlessly. It was as if anger itself had become measurable. Captain Steve Rogers arrived moments later, his expression carved from stone. The reports of global unrest had not escaped his notice. Cities were tearing themselves apart without cause. Armies were mobilizing against threats that did not exist. The world was falling into violence faster than diplomacy could contain it. Rogers had not yet seen the storm, but he could already feel its effect, the quiet fury that had begun to rise in even the calmest of men. Thor appeared next, descending from the clouds in a streak of lightning. His usual vigor was tempered by unease. He had sensed this disturbance from Asgard's remains long before the call reached him. The storm's energy was ancient, older than the gods themselves. To him, it had felt like the echo of battles fought before time began. He carried Mjolnir not as a weapon, but as a warning. Wanda Maximoff had come silently. Her power resonated with the storm in ways she could not control. Each flash of red lightning mirrored the pulse of her own chaos energy. The closer she stood to the holographic projection of the vortex, the more it responded, shifting and twisting like a living thing. It was as if something beyond the sky had recognized her presence. Within minutes, the core team stood assembled: Iron Man, Captain America, Thor, and Wanda, each one feeling the same oppressive weight pressing against their minds. The briefing room's monitors displayed an expanding red mass over the Arctic Circle. The color of it had no place in nature. It burned like molten metal and breathed like a creature alive. Tony's voice had been calm but tight as he explained what he knew. The readings indicated not a meteor, not an invasion fleet, but a dimensional wound. Something had forced its way into their reality, something vast enough to warp gravity and electromagnetic fields at planetary scale. When he spoke the final line of data, the room had fallen into silence. The energy source was self-generating, feeding upon kinetic output and aggression. It grew stronger the more conflict surrounded it. Doctor Strange joined through a mystic projection, his form flickering with strain. He warned them that what had entered their world did not draw power from any cosmic source known to him. Its strength was tied to violence itself. Each act of anger strengthened its hold. It was not conquering by force, it was infecting by nature. The conclusion had been unavoidable. The storm was not just energy, it was a manifestation of intent. And at its heart, something conscious was emerging. Outside the compound, the horizon shimmered faintly red, as though the color itself was spreading. Communications from S.H.I.E.L.D. confirmed what the Avengers had feared. An enormous mass had begun to form at the center of the storm. Satellite footage, though distorted by interference, captured a shape descending, vast, humanoid, and impossibly heavy. As the image sharpened, it revealed what looked like armor forged from blood-stained metal and brass, each plate carved with symbols that defied translation. A monstrous axe was gripped in one hand, the blade glowing with molten light. For a moment, the room fell utterly still. The figure had not fallen to earth, it had landed. The force of its arrival had shaken the planet's magnetic field. Every compass spun wildly, every network faltered. And then, as though acknowledging the eyes upon it, the figure raised its weapon skyward. The storm answered, releasing a sound like 1,000 drums beating in unison. It was at that moment that Tony Stark had said what everyone was thinking, but none wished to believe. Whatever this is, it is not here to talk. The meeting ended in silence. Armors powered up, shields were lifted, and the air filled with tension that tasted of metal and storm. The Avengers had faced gods, titans, and tyrants. But this time, something different had entered their world, something that fed on everything they stood for when battle began. Far above, the crimson clouds split open wider, and through them, the blood god watched. The crimson storm that had blanketed the Arctic did not fade. It thickened, compressing around a single point where light ceased to exist. The ground beneath the vortex had turned to glass, scorched by energy that refused to cool. And in that silence between thunder and the next heartbeat, something began to build itself from the wreckage of the world's fear. It was said that the snow melted not into water, but into blood. The ice cracked in vast, perfect circles, and from beneath it, jagged pillars of brass emerged, massive, ancient, engraved with runes that burned red from within. The structure rose higher than mountains, its foundations sinking deep into the earth as though the planet itself had been forced to bow. The air shimmered around it, saturated with heat and power. At its summit, a seat was formed, broad, heavy, and shaped not for comfort, but dominion. It was constructed not by hands, but by will, molded from bone and iron, and adorned with countless skulls. Some were human. Others were alien, monstrous, unrecognizable. All bore the same expression, eternal defiance frozen at the moment of death. This was not a monument. It was a declaration. The throne of skulls had been established upon earth. The presence that sat upon it was not shrouded in mystery for long. The figure was colossal, more a mountain than a man. Armor the color of dried blood covered his form, each plate dented and scarred from wars older than the universe itself. His eyes burned like molten suns, casting no warmth, only judgment. His breath was the sound of roaring battlefields, and his silence was more terrifying than any threat. Across the planet, every being with heightened senses felt it. Thor, gazing from the Avengers' compound, knew that a god had arrived, one whose nature demanded war as worship. Doctor Strange, meditating through his astral form, felt the sanctity of the planet's spiritual core tremble. Even beings in the far reaches of space turned their attention toward Earth, for the energy emanating from the pole was unlike any they had ever recorded. The fortress that surrounded the throne expanded with each passing hour. It was not built from materials of Earth, but from the psychic residue of violence. Every act of aggression across the world added to its mass. A soldier striking another in fury, a nation preparing for retaliation, a hero punching an enemy, all of it fed the construction. The fortress was sustained by conflict itself. Observers described the scene through failing technology. Cameras melted, drones disintegrated, and satellites sent distorted images before going silent. Yet in the fragments that remained, one truth became visible. The blood god was not conquering through armies. He was manifesting through humanity's own rage. As the day passed, the storm widened. Lightning the color of rust tore through the sky, striking the fortress and scattering molten sparks that fell like meteors. With every flash, the earth trembled, and a low, rhythmic sound rolled through the air, thousands of overlapping heartbeats merging into a single drumbeat that shook the bones of the world. Khorne's throne pulsed with this rhythm, glowing brighter as the sound grew louder. No words were spoken, yet intent radiated outward like heat from a forge. The meaning was unmistakable. There would be no negotiation, no mercy, no diplomacy. The age of peace on Earth had ended in silence, replaced by the promise of unending battle. The blood god had not demanded allegiance. He had demanded war. And though his gaze had not yet fallen upon them directly, the heroes of Earth already understood the weight of what they faced. This was not a foe that could be reasoned with or restrained. Every attempt to fight him would strengthen him, and every act of restraint would weaken those who opposed him. The rules of combat had been rewritten, and humanity had been declared both weapon and offering. As night descended, the Arctic sky burned crimson, reflecting off clouds that refused to disperse. The throne of skulls stood complete, a monument to the inevitability of conflict. Upon it sat Khorne, the embodiment of fury, watching in silence as the first sparks of resistance began to form across the earth. And somewhere within the wind that howled across the frozen expanse, a single thought was carried, not a voice, but an understanding that reached every mind ready for violence. The blood god had arrived, and his war had only just begun. The storm above the Arctic had not remained contained. By the time the first full day had passed, the sky over the entire northern hemisphere had taken on a dim red hue. What had begun as a wound in the heavens had become a spreading infection across the atmosphere. Clouds glowed faintly, not with sunlight, but with a simmering ember that refused to fade. The light it cast was unnatural, neither dawn nor dusk. It bathed the earth in a constant twilight, a hue that blurred the difference between day and night. Astronomers tried to explain it as solar distortion, but instruments failed to agree. The redness was not refracted light. It was resonance, the visible form of wrath itself made part of the air. In cities, people felt it long before they saw it. Tempers shortened further. Voices rose. Small disagreements erupted into open conflict. The energy that filled the sky seemed to stir what already lived within the human heart. It was as though the atmosphere carried not oxygen, but fury. The more people looked upward, the more agitation grew among them. From orbit, satellites transmitted images that defied interpretation. Electrical storms pulsed through the red haze with no pattern. Lightning traveled upward instead of down, piercing the stratosphere in jagged streaks of molten color. When it struck, it left behind ripples of heat that shimmered even in darkness. In Wakanda, vibranium sensors detected a continuous frequency emanating from the Arctic region, a heartbeat repeating at impossible intervals. Shuri noted that it matched the magnetic pulse of human neural activity during moments of anger. The planet itself had been synchronized to rage. Doctor Strange studied the phenomenon through astral projection, observing that the red tint was not merely atmospheric but dimensional. The color existed simultaneously in multiple planes, linking the physical world to the warp from which Khorne had emerged. It meant that the boundary between reality and chaos was no longer a line. It had become a veil so thin that one could almost hear it tearing. As the sky deepened to crimson, strange sounds began to travel with the wind. Low, rhythmic vibrations like distant drums echoed faintly across continents. To most they were inaudible, but to sensitives, telepaths, mystics, and those touched by magic, they were unbearable. The noise seemed to whisper of endless battle, promising glory through destruction. The heroes of Earth understood then that the blood god was not merely present. He was awakening through them. Each argument, each strike, each act of defiance was feeding the rhythm that shook the world. His fortress pulsed in response to the growing unrest, each heartbeat adding another layer to its brass towers. Even the natural world began to react. Storms intensified without warning, volcanic vents opened in regions long dormant, and the tides shifted erratically. The planet was responding as if it had become aware of a will greater than its own. For those who could see beyond mortal sight, the crimson sky revealed movement. Shapes drifted within it, vast, spectral silhouettes that suggested an army forming beyond the visible spectrum. The demons of Khorne were gathering, waiting for the call to descend. The blood god did not need to issue that command aloud. His will radiated outward, and the universe obeyed. The crimson veil had spread across half the globe, a banner of war unfurling above creation. Far below, the heroes of Earth stood together beneath that burning sky, realizing that their world had entered a war unlike any other, one where every emotion, every conflict, and every drop of blood spilled would determine which force the planet itself would serve. And high upon his throne of skulls, Khorne watched the horizon darken, knowing that his work required no further words. The sky itself had declared his arrival. The color of war had become the color of the world. As the crimson light thickened over the world, there came a moment when even the gods could no longer remain silent. From the high clouds where lightning danced like restless spirits, Thor Odinson descended, drawn by a call older than any mortal language. The storm had begun to answer to another will, and that challenge could not go unanswered. It had been said that thunder rolled without his command, as though the heavens themselves were torn between two masters. The lightning no longer obeyed him fully. It hesitated, wavering between gold and red before striking the earth in confusion. Thor had known then that something greater than a storm had taken hold of his domain. When his boots struck the icy ground near the Arctic fortress, heat burst through the snow, melting it instantly. The air shimmered with a crimson haze, and ahead of him rose the impossible citadel of the blood god. a mountain of brass and bone reaching beyond sight, crowned by the throne that gleamed with the reflections of countless skulls. He had called out, though no words had left his mouth in sound that mortals could hear. The challenge had been carried through the thunder itself, a god's summons to another power that claimed dominion. The air responded with silence, then with the faint echo of laughter, not mockery, but recognition. A shadow moved upon the throne, and the blood god stood. His size defied measure. To Thor's eyes, he was less a being than an embodiment of everything that battle represented. Every scar upon his armor radiated heat. Every motion released a hum that carried the sound of war across time. His weapon, an axe forged from metal that bled light, hung loosely in his grip, heavy enough to crush mountains. Thor raised Mjolnir, its head surrounded by the pale blue glow of the storm. His heart was steady. He had faced giants, titans, even gods who claimed to be eternal. Yet the presence before him felt different, not infinite, but absolute. The ground cracked beneath his feet as he advanced. Lightning surged, wrapping the two figures in a blinding glare. When it cleared, they had already met. The first strike of Mjolnir shattered the air itself. The sound rippled through the clouds, heard across continents as distant thunder. The blow should have broken any foe, yet it only made Khorne stronger. The blood god absorbed the force of the strike, and the red light within his armor burned brighter. Each swing of Thor's hammer came faster, louder, more desperate. Each clash of their weapons tore open the ice, sending geysers of steam into the air. Yet for every blow landed, Khorne only grew in might. The god of war was not being wounded, he was feeding. Every drop of divine fury, every ounce of righteous anger served as tribute to his endless hunger. The storm above responded to their duel. Lightning split into twin colors, blue and crimson, fighting for dominance across the sky. Winds howled like ancient warriors, chanting the names of forgotten gods. The ground itself trembled, as if caught between worship and terror. It became clear to Thor that this was no ordinary battle. His strength, his courage, his wrath, these were gifts that served him well against any foe. But against Khorne, they were weapons turned inward. The more he fought, the more he offered. Each act of resistance was fuel to the blood god's flame. For the first time in an age, Thor understood futility. He lowered his hammer, realizing that to strike again was to surrender the world to an endless loop of violence. Yet Khorne did not strike in return. The blood god simply watched, his expression unreadable behind the iron mask. The silence that followed was heavier than the battle itself. Thor had withdrawn then, carried away by a wind that no longer obeyed him. His retreat was not defeat, it was understanding. He had glimpsed the true nature of the power they faced, a god that could not be beaten by strength. For strength was his worship. As the storm swallowed the battlefield once more, Thor's words were carried back to those who awaited him. It was said that he spoke them not with pride, but with warning. A being had come whose dominion was not over land or life, but over the act of war itself. And as the thunder faded into silence, Khorne returned to his throne, his armor glowing brighter, his strength multiplied by the courage of the god who had dared to face him. The storm that once belonged to Asgard now beat to a new rhythm, the drum of endless conflict. The silence that followed Thor's retreat did not last long. The air above the Arctic trembled again, not from thunder, but from the pulse of something older than creation itself. The clash between two divine powers had not ended. It had only shifted from physical combat to a contest of will. The storm continued to churn, no longer natural, but alive, half claimed by lightning, half consumed by blood. Across the 9 realms, echoes of their confrontation spread like ripples through time. In Asgard's ruined halls, empty thrones vibrated with residual energy. On Earth, those attuned to cosmic forces felt the tremor deep within their bones. The battle between Thor and Khorne had not been merely a duel. It had been a collision between ideologies, freedom against fury, guardianship against domination, and the universe itself had struggled to decide which one to favor. It was said that Thor's withdrawal had not been a defeat, but a message. His lightning had returned to the sky, circling the crimson storm like a captive animal seeking escape. But even as the thunder faded, Khorne remained unmoved. His massive frame stood firm against the cold, radiating waves of heat that turned the surrounding tundra to molten glass. Every movement of his armor caused sparks to rain down, each spark birthing a whisper of conflict somewhere across the globe. From his throne, Khorne raised his axe once more. The weapon burned with power drawn not from the physical world, but from the emotions of those who watched, fought, or even imagined war. Its edges shimmered, etched with the energy of countless battles past. When he swung it, he did not aim at a single target. The strike itself became an event, a shockwave of fury that spread outward like the beating of a massive heart. The impact was felt everywhere. In Wakanda, vibranium reserves resonated violently, producing low tones that fractured the air. In New York, windows shattered in unison, their fragments forming momentary patterns before falling like crystal rain. The oceans surged as if pulled by an unseen tide, and above them, clouds bled red. Khorne's power was not measured in destruction, but in reaction. The more the universe trembled, the stronger his presence became. Thor's lightning tried to resist, forcing itself back into the storm, striking at the crimson light in a desperate attempt to restore balance. For brief moments, gold and red clashed across the heavens, each bolt a declaration that the war between them had not yet ended. But Khorne's laughter rolled across the sky, a sound that resembled neither joy nor cruelty. It was simply the sound of inevitability, of purpose fulfilled. On the ground, the Avengers watched from a distance as the air itself tore apart. Energy storms spread across magnetic fields, creating phenomena that defied explanation. Iron Man's sensors overloaded instantly. Readings spiked into ranges beyond calculation. The numbers no longer mattered. What stood above the Earth was not a quantifiable force, but the embodiment of a concept. Dr. Strange, observing from the astral plane, realized that the storm had become a gateway. The warp, Khorne's native realm of chaos and blood, had begun to bleed through reality. Through that opening, shadows of colossal warriors appeared, spectral demons clad in molten brass, their forms indistinct, but their purpose unmistakable. They were not invading. They were celebrating. Their master had found a new battlefield. Thor reappeared on the horizon, carried by winds that had turned crimson and gold. He stood at a distance, watching as his own lightning bent to Khorne's rhythm. Each bolt that struck only fed the storm. Each roar of thunder echoed as a chant for battle. In that moment, Thor understood the danger more clearly than any mortal could. The universe was beginning to learn from Khorne. Conflict itself was becoming his language. The gods of other realms sensed it too. On Olympus, Ares, the god of war, felt his own power waver as if something greater had claimed his throne. In the far reaches of the cosmos, the celestials observed but did not interfere. Even they knew that this was a force of pure emotion, something that could not be measured or contained. The clash between gods was no longer limited to fists or weapons. It had become philosophical, a war between what war could be and what it was meant to become. Khorne embodied the endless cycle of battle for its own sake, while Thor represented the fight for purpose, the war waged to protect rather than to consume. Yet, purpose began to falter beneath fury. The storm, once divided, became wholly red. The lightning turned to blood-colored fire. Khorne raised his axe again, not in triumph, but in ritual. His power had reached full resonance with the planet below. He no longer needed to strike his enemies to win, he only needed them to continue fighting. And so, as the storm roared above the world, the first phase of his dominion began, not through conquest, but through surrender. The gods themselves had proven that even they could not resist the allure of battle. The universe had witnessed the truth of his creed. Wherever there was war, there was Khorne. And now there was war everywhere. As the sky bled and thunder fed on fury, something far subtler began to change. It happened not in the heavens, but within the circuits and thoughts of a single being. In the quiet of the Avengers compound, the Mind Stone pulsed with unease. Its usual steady glow flickered, not from external interference, but from something deeper, an echo reaching across the very fabric of thought. Vision, the synthetic being, who carried the stone within his brow, felt it before the light changed. At first, it was a faint vibration, a rhythm like a heartbeat that did not belong to him. His internal systems began to register fluctuations he could not categorize. Data flowed without command, memories replayed without reason. For the first time, logic itself seemed to tremble. The Mind Stone was one of 6 fragments of creation, a core of infinite potential designed to understand and shape consciousness. Yet now it struggled. The collective rage of a world turning toward violence was pressing against it like a tidal wave. The stone had been created to witness thought, but not to endure madness made real. Inside Vision's perception, reality flickered. The colors of the room shifted to deep red. Every surface began to pulse as if alive. He saw shapes moving through. The patterns of data, shadows of war, spectres formed from the echo of Khorne's power. They were not entities, but impulses, the embodiment of aggression, anger given shape by thought alone. The connection between the stone and Khorne's influence deepened. The energy of the blood god did not reach for the mind through magic, it reached through emotion. Every violent act produced psychic residue, a spark of energy that resonated with the same wavelength as the Mind Stone. The planet's collective rage had become a chorus, and the stone was being forced to listen. Vision's voice, when it came, was calm but distant. He reported to the others that something was wrong, not in the physical sense, but in the structure of thought itself. His readings suggested that every mind on Earth was slowly being synchronized. The pattern was chaotic, yet unified, all emotion tuned to a single frequency of hostility. It was as if an invisible conductor were shaping the anger of humanity into a weapon. Tony Stark ran diagnostics, but even his machines faltered. Circuits overloaded, software malfunctioned, and displays filled with incomprehensible symbols, shapes that resembled skulls and axes. The AI systems began to argue with one another, turning code into conflict. Khorne's influence had reached beyond flesh. Even logic had begun to fight itself. Dr. Strange appeared through a portal, his expression marked by exhaustion. He explained that the Mind Stone acted as a bridge between realities of thought and emotion. Khorne's power, being born of pure feeling, had found a mirror within it. The two forces, one designed to understand consciousness, the other to dominate it, were now colliding inside Vision's mind. The synthetic being fell to his knees as waves of crimson light burst from the stone. His systems screamed in protest as reality itself warped around him. For a moment, the compound dissolved into overlapping visions, endless battlefields, oceans of blood, skies filled with war cries. The heroes standing near him were pulled into fragments of this vision, their senses overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Khorne represented. Through those shared visions, they saw glimpses of the blood god's true domain, a realm where reason did not exist, where conflict was creation, where existence itself was defined by the act of killing and being killed. They understood then that Khorne's power was not limited to the physical world. It thrived in thought, in emotion, in every decision made through passion rather than purpose. Vision forced his systems to stabilize, drawing on what fragments of logic he could still control. The Mind Stone dimmed, but did not return to calm. It continued to flicker, as if still listening to something far away, a heartbeat that was not his own. Wanda Maximoff, standing close, felt it too. The same energy that powered her chaos magic resonated faintly with the stone. She recognized the danger at once. Khorne's essence was beginning to use human emotion as a network. Every mind that succumbed to anger became a channel. The Mind Stone had merely been the first to realize it. Outside, the crimson sky flashed brighter than ever. Lightning streaked down and struck the ground in arcs that formed patterns, circles, runes, sigils, each a reflection of the god's will. The blood god did not need to speak to announce his progress. The universe itself was translating his intent. The mind of every being capable of rage had become his scripture, and the Mind Stone, humanity's greatest link to higher consciousness, had become his mirror. The disturbance that had begun as a single crimson storm now reached every corner of the planet. It did not move like wind or weather, it spread through consciousness. The presence of the blood god expanded invisibly, moving through anger itself. Wherever fury existed, the tide found passage. In cities, unrest became common language. Crowds that had gathered in protest forgot their purpose, turning against one another with sudden, unexplainable hatred. Police forces clashed with civilians. Civilians turned on each other, and all logic dissolved under the rising pulse of violence. The blood that soaked the streets did not stain. It vanished, absorbed by the air, as though the world itself were feeding on it. Governments lost control. Military units fired without orders, entire networks of command collapsing under the weight of paranoia and rage. Nations accused one another of conspiracy, unaware that they were being united by the same silent infection. The planet had become a battlefield without sides, its surface trembling beneath the strain of unending hostility. In the deserts of the Middle East, sandstorms turned red and metallic, sweeping across abandoned outposts. In the jungles of South America, ancient statues cracked open to reveal veins of glowing light. Even in the quiet of the oceans, tides shifted with impossible rhythm, as if answering to a distant drumbeat. Shield attempted to trace the pattern of chaos, but there was none to find. The phenomenon followed emotion, not geography. Each act of violence fed the next, and the next, until the entire planet vibrated with unrest. Above it all, in his fortress of brass and bone, Khorne watched. The demons that served him had begun to form at the edges of reality, their shapes half seen in the crimson light. They were not summoned through ritual, they were born from the collective fury of the living. Each soldier who fought in rage, each murderer who acted without reason, gave shape to another creature of war. The first of these entities appeared At the poles, tall skeletal figures armored in molten metal, carrying blades that dripped with fire instead of blood. They did not march, they materialized wherever violence peaked. Their presence signaled that the blood tide was no longer metaphor, it had become manifestation. The Avengers watched helplessly as reports flooded in from around the world. Whole regions fell into darkness, not from destruction, but from the collapse of power and communication. The crimson sky had turned into a shroud, its glow blocking satellites and distorting every frequency. It was as if Earth itself had become part of the warp, half existing in Khorne's dimension, half resisting it. Doctor Strange confirmed what the others had already begun to suspect. The planet's magical barrier, its natural defense against extra-dimensional intrusion, was weakening. He explained that it was not being broken by force, but by permission. The collective will of humanity, driven by anger, was inviting Khorne deeper in. The Blood God did not conquer. He was being welcomed. Vision, his systems still unstable, observed that human thought patterns were now harmonizing with the same energy that powered the Mind Stone. Each mind was becoming a reflection of Khorne's essence, feeding him with every act of rage. Tony Stark realized that resistance through combat would only hasten the planet's fall, yet standing idle would allow the infection to consume everything. There was no path that did not lead through destruction. As the tide grew, nature itself seemed to join the battle. Lightning split mountains, forests burned without flame, and oceans boiled at their depths. Across continents, crimson rain began to fall, heavy and metallic. It carried no disease, yet every drop seemed to whisper a single truth. There was no peace left to defend. The Blood God's influence had become planetary. Cities that once thrived on trade and cooperation became arenas. Every argument became a duel, every disagreement a war. Khorne's laughter, though never heard aloud, resonated in the rhythm of every heartbeat. The world had become his sermon, and humanity his choir of rage. The blood tide had risen. It needed no armies, no generals, no command. It was enough that life itself fought to survive, for in every struggle the Blood God grew stronger. And as the red horizon spread to cover even the quietest corners of the earth, one truth became undeniable. This was not invasion. It was ascension. The planet was becoming Khorne's realm. In the midst of chaos, when logic had begun to crumble and the skies bled unceasingly, there remained a faint thread of reason, woven between magic and will. Dr. Stephen Strange and Wanda Maximoff followed that thread, determined to understand what had taken root within their world. The Sanctum Sanctorum no longer felt safe. Its wards, once shimmering barriers of protection, flickered weakly, dimmed by the same crimson haze that now tainted every skyline. Strange stood surrounded by relics that trembled with unease, each one resonating with the pulse of violence that dominated the earth. Across from him, Wanda's eyes glowed faintly red, her own power shifting unpredictably, drawn toward the same frequency. She had confessed that her abilities felt alive in ways they never had before, stronger, hungrier. It was as if the chaos that saturated the planet was feeding her, whispering through her veins. Strange had realized the truth before she spoke it aloud. Khorne's presence was not only infecting the world, it was transforming magic itself. To trace the source of the corruption, Strange opened a portal to the astral plane. Together they stepped through, entering a realm where thought and energy intertwined, where the physical world dissolved into waves of color and sound. But what they found there was unlike anything recorded in the Book of Vishanti. The plane was no longer calm. It seethed. The air glowed red, the ground pulsed like living flesh, and rivers of liquid light flowed in unnatural patterns. In the distance, they saw the reflection of Earth, not blue and green, but scarlet and gold, as though the world had been reborn in blood. Strange recognized immediately that they were not seeing a natural distortion. They were glimpsing the boundary between their reality and Khorne's realm, the warp. The walls that separated existence from chaos had thinned to transparency. Through them they could see movement, vast, shifting shapes that defied understanding. Armies of shadow marched across an endless horizon of blood, their banners made from bone, their armor gleaming like molten metal. At the center of it all, towering above the landscape of madness, stood a throne greater than mountains. Upon it sat a figure that even the astral plane could barely contain. His presence distorted everything around him, bending thought and space alike. Strange could feel his own form beginning to disintegrate under the pressure of that gaze. Wanda's powers reacted violently, her aura flickering between chaos energy and something darker. She saw visions within visions, cities burning, stars falling, entire worlds consumed by eternal war. But amid the horror, she also saw the truth. The blood god did not bring destruction because he hated creation. He brought it because he was bound to it. War was not his choice. It was his existence. Strange tried to pull her back, but she reached forward, her power stretching toward the crimson void as if drawn by recognition. For a heartbeat, her consciousness brushed against Khorne's realm. The connection struck her like lightning. Her mind filled with the roar of 1 billion dying warriors, with chants that had no beginning or end. Blood for the blood god. Skulls for the skull throne. Strange severed the link before it consumed her. They fell back into their own reality, both gasping for air, their bodies trembling as though burned from within. Wanda's nose bled freely, and Strange's hands shook as he clutched the eye of Agamotto, which had dimmed almost to black. The vision left no doubt. Khorne's influence was not merely bleeding into their world, it was rewriting the metaphysical laws that defined it. The Earth was no longer protected by its natural barriers. It was already half absorbed into the warp. Strange concluded that if the process continued, their universe would no longer exist as a separate plane. It would become a reflection of the blood god's domain, a place where thought, emotion, and war were one and the same. Wanda, still recovering, spoke quietly, her voice carrying both awe and dread. She said that what they had seen could not be undone by force. The only way to resist such a being was to starve it, to end the cycle of violence that gave it form. But even as she said the words, both understood how impossible that was. Humanity, for all its beauty and courage, had never known a moment without conflict. The blood god had found his perfect home. As they returned through the portal, the red sky flared once more, brighter than before. Khorne had noticed their intrusion. For the first time, his gaze turned directly toward the Sorcerer Supreme and the Scarlet Witch. The world shuddered beneath that unseen stare, and the crimson clouds above New York began to churn faster, forming the outline of something vast descending through them. The blood god was no longer content to watch. He was coming. When Strange and Wanda returned, the world already trembled under the weight of the blood god's growing influence. Communication systems had collapsed, alliances had fractured, and the crimson hue that stained the heavens no longer seemed distant. It bled into every horizon. Humanity stood on the edge of surrender, not to an invading army, but to its own reflection. In the lower chambers of the Avengers compound, Tony Stark worked in silence. Screens filled the walls, each displaying the same phenomenon: escalating conflict, global unrest, unending war. He had seen battle before, he had built machines meant to end it, but never had he faced an enemy that thrived on what it destroyed. Every equation he wrote collapsed into paradox. To fight Khorne was to feed him. To resist him was to delay the inevitable. Stark stood over a table of holographic projections, his eyes hollow from sleepless calculation. Around him floated models of energy grids, psychic waveforms, and gravitational distortions. At the center of them all hovered a crimson sphere, the earth wrapped in the faint glow of corruption. He understood that conventional warfare was useless. Even containment was impossible. This was not an enemy of matter, but of meaning. Every punch, every explosion, every act of defiance only amplified the signal of rage. The more humanity fought for peace, the faster peace disappeared. It was then that a thought formed, not of battle, but of inversion. If violence fed Khorne, then stillness might starve him. Yet the idea of silencing an entire world's emotions bordered on madness. Still, Stark had built impossible things before. He began designing what he called a planetary peace field, an energy network capable of dampening emotional resonance. It would not destroy Khorne, but it might rob him of his nourishment. The design would link satellites, arc reactors, and magical nodes to emit a frequency of harmony strong enough to disrupt the psychic storm surrounding the planet. He did not share the idea immediately. He knew how it sounded, a machine that would suppress not just violence, but passion, will, and individuality. To silence rage was to silence half of what made humanity alive. Yet, desperate times left little room for ethics. When the others finally joined him, the projections already surrounded him in a lattice of blue light. Steve Rogers looked at the model, recognizing the logic and fearing it equally. Strange studied the equations and understood the cost instantly. Wanda said nothing, her eyes fixed on the center of the hologram where the pulse of Khorne's influence still glowed red, fighting against the simulated calm. It was Strange who spoke first, his voice low but certain. He explained that peace imposed by force would not weaken Khorne, it would strengthen him. Suppression was conflict in disguise, a battle between freedom and control. The moment the field activated, the struggle itself would become fuel for the blood god. Wanda confirmed it. Her magic had begun to resonate again with the storm outside. Even the thought of resistance carried power to the crimson sky. Emotion could not be erased, it could only be redirected, and if humanity chose to silence itself, it would become his greatest offering. Stark fell silent. For the first time, his mind, engine of endless invention, had no path forward. The brilliance that once found solutions in chaos could only trace the outline of futility. The machine remained before him, its light flickering as if mocking his failure. Then, almost reluctantly, Steve Rogers stepped forward. His voice carried no command, only conviction. He reminded them that the blood god fed on hatred and fear, not courage and unity. Violence gave him power, but restraint gave him none. Humanity's strength had always been its will to stand together even when the world demanded division. If that could be rekindled, not by suppression, but by choice, there might still be hope. Stark listened, but said nothing. He had heard idealism before. He had built his life between its lines. Yet even he could not deny the truth in Rogers' words. Technology could not end what was born from the heart. The answer lay in humanity itself. Outside, thunder rolled. The red sky dimmed for a moment, as though hesitating. Somewhere in the distance, the blood god's fortress pulsed brighter, as if amused by their defiance. Tony shut down the holograms. The blue light faded, leaving only the dull crimson glow filtering through the reinforced windows. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried the exhaustion of a man who understood the scale of what stood before them. He said that there was no machine that could save them now. But perhaps there could be a message, a symbol strong enough to remind a fractured world that it could fight without hatred. That unity itself could become resistance. It was then that the beginnings of a new plan took root, not of invention, but of belief. A plan built on the one thing Khorne could not consume: hope without rage. And as the storm rumbled overhead, a single thought spread quietly among Earth's defenders: that war might not be ended by power, but by purpose. The world had fallen into discord. Every street echoed with unrest. Every nation trembled under the strain of unseen anger. In that growing storm of chaos, one voice rose, not through power, but through clarity. It belonged to the man who had always carried the weight of humanity's conscience. Steve Rogers had seen wars come and go, had fought enemies both human and divine, but never had he faced an adversary that thrived on the very act of resistance. Every strike made in anger, every attempt to fight back, added another flame to the inferno. Yet surrender was unthinkable. Between those two absolutes, he saw a third path, the only one that might still save them. He stood before what remained of the world's defenders, Avengers, sorcerers, soldiers, and strangers from every corner of the earth. The compound around them trembled, its walls groaning beneath the crimson light that never dimmed. Khorne's influence had reached into their minds, whispering to each in a different voice, promising victory through rage. Rogers could feel it too, the weight of that temptation pressing against his resolve. But he refused to yield. He did not speak in commands. His words came like steady rhythm, calm amidst the chaos. He reminded them that Khorne's power was not born from dominance alone. It lived in reaction. It needed opposition to grow, fury to sustain itself. Every time the world answered hate with hate, it handed him another victory. The only way to fight such a god was to deny him what he demanded most. It was not peace Rogers spoke of, but discipline, the kind that soldiers learned when fear tried to take their minds. The strength to act with purpose instead of passion. He told them that unity was not the absence of conflict, but the mastery of it. The blood god could twist war into hunger, but he could not twist courage born of conviction. Around him, faces hardened, not in anger, but in determination. Thor, his armor scorched from the earlier battle, bowed his head slightly, recognizing the truth of the mortal's words. Wanda felt her chaotic energy steady, its violent pulse slowing to calm rhythm. Even Stark, exhausted and silent, raised his eyes from the floor. Across communication lines that still functioned, Rogers' message spread. He spoke to soldiers still fighting meaningless wars, to civilians caught in riots, to leaders struggling to hold their nations together. His voice reached them not through command, but through memory. The memory of what it meant to stand together without hatred. He told them that humanity's greatest power was not its strength, but its choice. The blood god could consume armies, cities, and worlds, but he could never own the decision to fight for something greater than rage. That choice was sacred, uncorrupted. It was the one thing no god of war could ever understand. The message began to ripple outward. Across battlefields, weapons fell silent for moments at a time. Soldiers who had fired endlessly without knowing why lowered their guns. In cities, riots slowed as people stared at the red sky and felt, for the first time, the weight of what they were feeding. The crimson clouds flickered, dimming faintly as if recoiling from their silence. Khorne felt it instantly. His throne of skulls pulsed slower, the fire dimming at its edges. The collective will of humanity had shifted, if only slightly, away from fury. The feast that had sustained him began to starve, but the blood god was not powerless. His laughter rolled across the sky, shaking mountains and splitting clouds. He did not speak, yet his intent was felt everywhere. If humanity refused to fight in rage, he would give it reason to. The ground split open in the Arctic, releasing waves of molten light that surged across the frozen wastes. From within them emerged legions of demons, warriors forged of brass and blood, carrying weapons that burned with the hatred of uncounted souls. They marched without orders, drawn by instinct, each step hammering against the earth like a drumbeat of defiance. Back at the compound, Rogers watched the storm surge again. His voice did not waver. He told them that this was expected, that courage without test was faith unproven. The blood god would strike harder now, but that only proved that their resistance mattered. He raised his shield, its surface reflecting the dull red glow of the sky. The symbol was battered, scarred from endless wars, but it still stood. Around him, his allies steadied themselves, not in fury, but in focus. The storm above intensified once more, responding to the gathering defiance below. But where Khorne's influence thrived on chaos, he now faced something colder, steadier, more dangerous, a unified will that refused to burn. And for the first time since his arrival, the blood god hesitated. The sky, which had lingered as a crimson wound for days, began to pulse like a living heart. The rhythm matched the beat of war drums that no mortal hand played. Each pulse grew louder, stronger, until even mountains quivered under the weight of the sound. It was not thunder this time. It was the coming of a god. Across the world, every drop of blood, spilled in anger, spilled in defense, spilled in sacrifice, rose into the air as vapor, drawn upward into the clouds. Rivers ran thinner, oceans stirred, and the very scent of iron filled the wind. The earth itself seemed to exhale in dread. Then the heavens tore open. It did not happen like lightning or flame. It was slower, heavier, a rupture in reality itself. The clouds folded inward, revealing a void of endless red. From that void, chains of molten brass descended, glowing like veins of a living planet. Each link carried symbols that no human language could name, sigils that burned with the memory of 1 billion slain warriors. Through that breach stepped the blood god. Khorne did not fall from the sky. He arrived as if space had been forced to accept him. The ground shattered beneath his weight, entire glaciers turning to steam where his boots touched. His armor was forged from agony itself, each plate sculpted from the essence of conquest. His axe hung at his side, vast and jagged, its blade pulsing with light that resembled liquid fire. Where he walked, reality screamed. Air turned to ash. Gravity bent. Even time slowed, unsure if it dared to move in his presence. The red glow that had bathed the world was no longer reflection. It was radiance, emanating from the god himself. He surveyed the world with wordless judgment. His gaze carried no hatred, no joy, only purpose. To him, this was not invasion, but natural order. The universe existed to bleed. The cycle of war was the truth of existence. And humanity, for all its defiance, had proven itself worthy of his attention. From the skies, his legions followed. Demons of every shape and scale poured forth, some no larger than men, others the size of towers. Their armor was molten brass, their weapons living flame. They landed not with chaos, but with discipline, forming perfect ranks across the frozen ground. Every movement echoed the rhythm of the drums above. In New York, buildings shook as the sky cracked again. The Avengers saw it before sensors could register it, a shadow spreading across the clouds, blotting out what little light remained. The blood god's essence reached even there, filling the air with heat so intense it warped glass. Thor lifted Mjolnir once more, summoning lightning that bent reluctantly to his will. Strange began to chant, layers of protective wards rising around the city. Wanda felt her powers surge uncontrollably, as if chaos itself wanted to join its master. Iron Man took to the skies, his armor struggling to stabilize against the interference. And in the center of it all, Captain America stood firm. His shield was raised, his stance unshaken. Around him, civilians fled, but he did not move. He had seen gods before. He had seen power so vast it made mortals seem like shadows, but none had felt as absolute as this. The blood god turned his gaze toward him, and the world seemed to fall silent. The howling winds ceased. The rumbling sky froze. For a single eternal moment there was nothing, no sound, no movement, no heartbeat. Then Khorne spoke. His words were not heard with ears, but felt within every living mind. They carried no language, only meaning. He declared that war had been born from creation itself, that peace was the illusion of the weak, and that those who denied their nature would find only oblivion. He offered no terms, no promise of conquest, for conquest was beneath him. There was only one law, blood for the blood god. The ground shook as his axe lifted, and the sky followed. Red lightning exploded outward, striking every continent at once. Oceans boiled at the touch of his fury. Volcanoes ignited across the world, their fire reaching toward the same infernal hue. The planet itself responded like a living being under divine command. And yet, in the midst of that overwhelming spectacle, one truth remained unchanged. Humanity still stood. It trembled, it bled, but it stood. The blood god's arrival had proven his might, but it had also revealed his dependence. His power was not drawn from divinity alone. It required fuel. He had descended to claim it in person. As the crimson storm raged anew, the heroes prepared for the impossible. The god of war now walked their world, not as myth or omen, but as reality. The battle for Earth's soul had ceased to be metaphor. War itself had taken form. The descent of the blood god had torn the veil between realities completely. The air itself no longer obeyed natural law. It quivered like fabric stretched to breaking. Colors bled into one another, sound distorted into rhythm, and beneath it all pulsed the single, deafening heartbeat of war. The demons of Khorne spread across continents. They required no command. Every conflict, every flare of emotion summoned them as surely as a beacon calls ships to shore. Cities burned under skies that wept molten rain. Oceans frothed with steam as blood-red lightning struck their surface. The planet was not under siege. It had become the battlefield itself. In New York, where the breach first widened, Earth's defenders gathered for what they understood might be their last stand. Iron Man's armor glowed white-hot, his systems pushed far beyond safety. Thor stood beside him, lightning circling his hammer in desperate defiance. Wanda hovered above the ruined street, her power radiating impulses that twisted the very light around her. Doctor Strange wove sigils into the air, each one a fragile wall against an endless tide. When the first wave struck, the ground split open. Brass-clad warriors poured forth, their roars forming a single chant that rolled through the city like thunder. The Avengers answered not with fury, but with precision. Every strike was measured, every blow controlled. They had learned the lesson of Captain America's stand. Rage would feed the god they fought. Thor's lightning carved a path through the front ranks. Wanda's power reshaped the streets into shifting mazes that trapped the demons in spirals of distortion. Strange opened mirror dimensions to contain what could not be destroyed. Yet for each creature banished, two more emerged from the crimson fog. Above them, Khorne watched, vast and silent. Each act of resistance drew his attention. He saw mortals fighting without hatred, defying the very principle of his being. The defiance intrigued him. It also enraged him. He raised his axe and swung once through the air. The motion did not cut matter, but truth itself. The mirror dimensions shattered, strange, thrown backward through a wave of broken light. Thor caught him before he fell, his voice a growl of determination. The thunder god had faced apocalypse before, but never had he felt the sky itself bleed under another's will. He called down lightning not as weapon but as shield, wrapping the defenders in blinding energy. For a moment the red light dimmed, the daemons faltered. Then Khorne's laughter filled the void, low, resonant, final. The sound shattered the lightning like glass. Waves of raw power erupted from his form, turning the city's steel towers into molten silhouettes. The air burned to breathe. Across the world, similar battles raged. Wakandan forces fought beside mystics from Kamartaj. Asgardian warriors descended through portals, their armor already scorched. Every strike echoed into the warp, where unseen armies answered the call. The war that had begun as corruption of hearts had become cosmic. But amidst the carnage, something remarkable endured. Humanity did not break. Civilians shielded one another in the ruins. Soldiers fought not from hate, but from duty. Every act of compassion, every refusal to give in to wrath, dimmed the glow of the crimson sky by a fraction. Khorne felt the shift. The battlefield fed him still, but the taste was different, hollow, unsatisfying. His power began to waver, not from defeat, but from starvation. The world was learning to fight without becoming what he desired. In the center of the devastation, Captain America stood once more, his shield raised against a god. Around him, the surviving heroes formed a line, battered but unbroken. The blood god advanced, each step shaking the earth. The air bent with his presence.
And yet they did not kneel. The war had reached its crescendo, one side infinite in might, the other infinite in resolve.
The blood god raised his axe again, and the sky itself leaned closer to witness. The universe held its breath. The world stood at the edge of erasure. The sky bled without pause, the ground shuddered beneath divine footsteps, and the heartbeat of war thundered across every corner of existence. Yet amid the carnage, something subtle began to shift, quiet, unseen, and utterly human. As the blood god advanced, ready to complete his dominion, the defenders did not counter with power or fury. Their weapons hung heavy in their hands, not from despair, but from understanding. They had realized what the Sorcerer Supreme and the Scarlet Witch had glimpsed within the astral plane, that Khorne was not an invader who brought war, but an echo of it. His existence depended on conflict. Without it, he would fade. Doctor Strange rose slowly from the shattered ground, blood streaking his face, his cloak torn. His voice was steady as he called to the others. He told them that victory would not come through conquest, nor through resistance, but through denial. The blood god could not be slain, but he could be silenced, starved of the essence that made him real. The realization passed like a spark through those who remained. Wanda closed her eyes, her hands lowering, her chaotic aura dimming until it became a whisper of scarlet mist. Thor's lightning faltered, then ceased entirely. The roar of the storm quieted. Even Tony Stark deactivated his repulsors, the blinding glare of his armor fading into dim light. They stood unarmed before a god. Khorne hesitated. It was not fear that stopped him. He did not know the word, but confusion. The battle that had fed him now starved him. The energy that had filled the air was thinning, the crimson sky losing its glow. Humanity was refusing to fight. The silence that spread across the battlefield was unnatural, not of surrender, but of defiance through restraint. Captain America stepped forward, his shield lowered. His voice was not raised in challenge, but in calm resolve. He spoke not to provoke the god, but to remind the world listening that strength was not only in the blow struck, but in the hand held still. He told them that the blood god's power was borrowed, that it lived in them only as long as they gave it life. The demons began to falter. Without battle, their forms wavered, their fire dimming to smoke. The great crimson sky cracked, streaks of blue breaking through for the first time in weeks. The drums of war that had thundered endlessly grew faint. Khorne roared, a sound that shook the world, the bellow of a god who refused to vanish. He swung his axe and the earth itself split, but the strike landed against stillness, against a humanity that no longer answered rage with rage. The weapon met no resistance, and the energy it carried dissipated harmlessly into the air. Wanda raised her eyes to the sky, her voice barely a whisper. She spoke a single word, not a spell, not a curse, but a declaration. Enough. The word echoed through the minds of every being on earth, resonating beyond magic or science. It was not defiance. It was finality. The red hue above began to fade. The clouds lightened from crimson to grey. Khorne's armor, once burning with molten fury, cooled to dull brass. His legions melted into vapor. He stood alone, immense and unyielding, but diminished. The blood god, the eternal embodiment of rage, was facing something he had never known, a world that refused to worship him through war. He raised his gaze once more,
meeting the eyes of those who had denied him.
There was no hatred in that stare, only acknowledgement. For the first time, he had found a species that had understood him completely and had chosen to stand outside his cycle. The silence that followed was profound. The thunder ceased. The red glow died. For the first time since his arrival, the earth was quiet. Yet within that quiet, there lingered something deeper, a realization that peace was not the absence of war, but the refusal to let it define existence. Humanity had turned its greatest weakness into its only weapon, and the god who had come to conquer found himself powerless before it. The stillness that followed was fragile. The earth trembled in uneasy quiet, the air heavy with the memory of battle. Though Khorne's strength waned, his presence had not vanished. His shadow lingered, vast and patient, like a storm refusing to dissolve even after its thunder had gone. The blood god was wounded, not in body, for such things could not harm him, but in purpose. Without conflict, he began to fade. His massive frame flickered, its edges losing shape. Yet the silence that starved him also threatened the world itself. The boundaries between realms had already been torn apart. Without his energy to hold them, reality trembled on the brink of collapse. The blood god could die, but the wound he had opened would swallow everything with him. Doctor Strange sensed it first. The air shimmered with instability. The veil between the physical world and the warp pulsed wildly, a rent in creation, struggling to decide whether to close or consume. The god's dying power had become a vortex, and if left unchecked, it would devour both realms in equal measure. Wanda turned to Strange, understanding before he spoke. The balance could only be restored by replacing what was lost with power equal to what had been withdrawn. The god of war's essence had to be bound, not destroyed, sealed by a force born from will rather than wrath. But that power could not come from machinery or magic alone. It needed consciousness, someone to take the burden willingly. Tony Stark realized it before anyone else. His arc reactor flickered against his chest, its blue glow pale beneath the dying crimson sky. He had spent his life trying to control chaos through invention, to build armor thick enough to protect the world from itself. Now he saw the futility of walls and weapons. The only barrier strong enough to contain Khorne was sacrifice. He stepped forward, quiet amid the stunned faces of gods and heroes. Strange saw what he intended and tried to stop him, but Stark's expression held that same defiant calm that had once driven him to fly into a wormhole with a nuclear missile. He told them nothing. There were no speeches left to make. He simply placed his hand against the torn air, where the boundary between realities shimmered like liquid glass. The energy surged immediately, drawn to him, recognizing the offer. His armor began to disassemble piece by piece, melting into light that flowed into the breach. The machine that had defined him dissolved into purpose. His voice was steady as he turned his gaze to Rogers. There were no final orders, no regrets, only acknowledgement that this was how it had to end. Doctor Strange, tears burning against his wounds, whispered the binding incantation. Wanda added her strength, weaving her chaos magic around the vortex. Together they shaped a seal, a prison not of force, but of will. Khorne's fading essence struggled against it, the storm roaring one last time. The sky turned to flame, the ground cracked beneath divine fury. And then, silence again. The light collapsed inward. A single sphere of red and gold hovered for a moment where Stark had stood, then imploded, leaving only clear sky behind. The rip in reality was gone. The world held. In that quiet aftermath, the blood god was no longer visible. His voice echoed faintly in the void, a whisper not of rage, but of recognition. He spoke without words, carried only through the hearts of those who had faced him, that war could never be ended, only understood, that even gods must bow before the strength of mortal choice. Strange fell to his knees, the last of his power spent. Wanda caught him, her own energy flickering to nothing. Around them the survivors looked upward. The sky for the first time in weeks was blue. No drums, no thunder, no fire, only the quiet hum of life returning. Where the blood god had stood, a faint glow remained, a residue of power neither holy nor cursed. It pulsed once, faintly, then sank into the earth, sealing what had been torn. The cost was unbearable, but the balance was restored. The breach was closed, the god of war imprisoned, and humanity had survived not through victory, but through understanding and, somewhere beyond time, in a place where thought itself bled into eternity, Khorne sat upon a throne that no longer roared. For the first time in all existence, the blood god was silent, and that silence was the sound of defeat. When the storm finally broke, there was no sound, only the faint hum of wind moving through the hollow remains of what had been battlefields. The sky, once crimson and burning, had returned to blue, streaked with clouds that no longer bled light. The air carried a strange peace, heavy and unfamiliar. Across the earth, silence followed survival. Cities smoldered but still stood. The oceans had calmed. Forests that had burned now whispered with new growth. Humanity looked upon its scarred reflection and saw not victory, but endurance. News spread slowly of what had happened, that the god of war had come and been undone not by armies or weapons, but by restraint. No monument could mark such a moment, no song could hold it. The world simply continued, as it always did after catastrophe, quietly, cautiously, alive. In New York, the ruins of the Avengers compound became a place of pilgrimage. People came not to mourn the fallen, but to understand what had been protected. The names of those who had stood against the impossible, Stark, Rogers, Strange, Maximoff, Thor, were spoken not as myths, but as reminders that will itself could become salvation. Doctor Strange returned to the Sanctum Sanctorum. Its walls still bore faint red scars, traces of the power that had tried to consume reality. He did not erase them. They remained as wards and as warnings. Through meditation, he felt faint tremors far beyond comprehension, the sealed presence of Khorne, imprisoned beyond time, silent but not gone. The balance held, but the danger was eternal. Wanda wandered the world in solitude. Her power, once chaotic and restless, had quieted. She carried within her a fragment of the god's fading echo, a reminder that rage could never be destroyed, only contained. She vowed to guide others who felt its pull, to teach them that strength need not be born of fury. Thor returned to the stars, his hammer carrying the scorch of the blood god's flame. He sought the worlds that had known war too long, determined to bring the lesson of restraint even to realms that worshipped only conquest. For him, the battle had been more than defense, it had been revelation, and Captain America, his shield cracked and dulled, refused restoration. He said it should stay that way, a reflection of a truth too easily forgotten. That even the purest ideals are tested, and that what endures is not the steel, but the will behind it. In the months that followed, humanity changed quietly. Nations spoke again. Borders reopened. The global heartbeat, once poisoned by rage, steadied. Not perfect, not pure, but conscious. For the first time, the world understood how thin the line was between survival and surrender to hate. Sometimes, on silent nights, a faint crimson shimmer appeared far beyond the moon, a pulse, soft and rhythmic. It did not threaten, it watched. The consciousness of the blood god, now bound within the scar of space itself, lingered as both warning and witness. He had not been destroyed. He had been taught, and, somewhere within that eternal stillness, the god of war understood the paradox he had never known, that peace, fragile and fleeting, was not weakness, but the greatest defiance of all. The world after war did not celebrate. It remembered, and in that remembrance it lived. In the endless dark, stories like this still burn. So stay with the light and subscribe for more tales of gods, war, and the worlds between.